Hi, good morning and good afternoon. I'm Charles Fenton from Potentium, launching our first webinar series on building high performance teams. And we start today with how to build high performance data analytics teams. I here founded Potentium. Previously, I was a founder of an energy services business where energy analytics was a key part of what we did. And so I had a lot of experience in building out teams in locations like Romania and India. I'm joined here today by my colleague, James Gardner, who advises many of our clients on how to build out their capabilities in the data analytics space. James, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm James Gardner. I've been consulting for the last 10 years in data analytics. I'm a former data engineer and I help advise clients of Potentium on building their analytics teams as well as their architecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. The purpose of today's session is to understand the business opportunity, but also how to deliver high performance teams. And we're going to cover off a number of questions. Firstly, the business case for building a data analytics capability. And then around that, how you can actually deliver your vision with the right capability structure. And of course, trying to determine what that gap is between where you are today and where you're trying to get to. And then once you're in the process of scaling your team, how to ensure you can scale it without breaking it. And I think that's probably one of the most challenging things that we see with clients. In most cases, they have some type of data capability, then it's a scaling and moving up the maturity curve and up the value area. And looking at the options, do you insource everything you build, or do you outsource it? Or indeed, do you do offshore? And then if you are going to insource, outsource, or indeed offshore, where might you build your team? And what are selection criteria for that team? And finally, what steps do you take to build that data capability plan to make it a success? So we start with the opportunity. That's the first question I'd like James to address is, how do we determine the business case for this? Because this is clearly transformational, and it has the potential to deliver more insights as a service to clients, a new business stream. It has the opportunity to provide you with a better visibility of your processes, more strategic insight, and also reduce costs in areas such as capacity utilization. But James, maybe you can talk about how you're advising clients at the moment, how to understand that business case and the key criteria around that.
Let's start with, first of all, identifying the opportunities within your business and attaching to that and quantifying the benefits that you can derive from that, as well as the costs. So the cost of your resources, any data sets that you have to acquire, and the technologies for the architecture that you'll need to implement. And then you offset that against the benefits that you'll see. And most often, especially as the first few opportunities, it has been with the clients that we have new revenue. So often they're sitting on a wealth of data and they're not yet exposing that or monetizing it in any way. So generally it starts off with that new revenue stream. Sometimes there's also cost savings. Often a client will sit with the problem that they're trying to solve, something that's costing them a lot of money. And by doing it this way, they're able to solve that problem and generate cost savings. And then further down the road, often into the optimization and productivity gain and get some benefits there. So it's about trying to quantify that value as well as the costs and building that business case from.
And I think it's probably one of the biggest hurdles that clients often face. They often fall into providing some sort of data service, and maybe they already have a sizable technology team, but then they begin to wonder what might the opportunity be to extend out some of the insight services that I'm already delivering internally to my clients externally. And that's often the sort of first stage. But it's then, how do I do that? How do I scale out the team? And most importantly, what capabilities do I require to do that? Again, James, maybe you can comment on that question about what, because you can do so much. To some extent, it is a case of what is the return on investment, because you're getting some very serious capital expenditure here.
Yeah. So it's about identifying, we'll get into this, I'm sure, in a moment, but it's about identifying where you are on that maturity curve. First of all, to understand what it is that you're missing. But what we do is we start off with that vision of the business and the vision for your analytics team. And once you understand those two things, you can identify where you're looking to get to and what capabilities you need in order to meet that vision. And those capabilities fall into these 5 tiers that you see in front of you. And this is the typical architecture that analytics platforms follow. You have your sources, your integration layer, your warehousing analytics presentation. So your sources or your data sources that you would be using. Integration, that's where you integrate those various data sources, you transform it into this analytics format, and then you store them in your warehousing layer. Then you have your analytics layer, and that's where you perform some of those calculations and you build your models. And finally, your presentation layer, and that's where you report on this data. You create your dashboards and reports.
James, what do you think comes first? The people, the processes, or the architectural tools?
When we talk about capabilities, like the capabilities in front of you here, like predictive analytics, we're talking about, like you said, Charles, people, process, and technology and assets. Those are the 4 pillars that we talk about. And when you're talking about a new capability, it's important to identify what you currently have. So the problem is you don't have a capability unless you have all 4 of those pillars. So depending on what you've already got, if you've got the people, you might not have the process, or you might not have the technology. You need that new tool in order to fulfill this capability that you're missing. So it's important to identify what you have already, and then you need all of them really to have a capability.
Which is a nice segue to determining where you are. More importantly, where you're trying to get to. Because one of the key considerations for every client is it's trying to understand what is necessary in order to deliver that objective. We have looked at the world from an early, intermediate, advanced, transformational. This is a very sort of basic way of categorizing the stage of maturity. But James, maybe you can comment on this and also give us an indication of where most SMEs are today, as an example.
So I'd say most are either in the stage or perhaps in the intermediate stage. So the early stage, that's where you are performing some reporting, but it's directly off of your source systems. So those are either static reports or manual reports, but they could be more sophisticated. You could have Tableau or Power BI running, but it's running against your sources. When you do that, you run into a number of different issues eventually, like the complexity of the reports, the performance of the reports, the development time to develop new reports and to maintain your existing reports and make changes. Those are the typical issues that you run into. Also, you wouldn't be able to report on certain things because you're not integrating various data sources together. You're reporting more in a silo. Intermediate is that's really where you solve those issues. And the solution for that is to build data once and data warehouse. So dimensional modeling. So you're structuring that data in a different format to your normal source data. And in this stage, this is where you perform your descriptive analytics or diagnostic analytics. So typically it's backwards facing, it's historical, but you can still do some sophisticated reporting looking at historical data. Now, the biggest step is when you move to advanced, and that's where it's future facing. You're now doing predictive analytics. So you're taking your historical data, you're now mining it, and you're using that to build models that can predict future events. So this is where you perform your forecasting. You might be segmenting your data sets, classifying features, you're detecting anomalies. That's in advanced. Then transformational, that last step is now you're performing prescriptive analytics. So not only are you able to predict what's coming, able to prescribe actions that should occur in order to influence the outcome of your surveys. This is where you embed it back in your product and service as well.
And I think it's fair to say that most businesses that we face are in that early stage, maybe potentially intermediate phase. And for those clients that are in the analytics practicing area, they may well be in the advanced or transformational, but actually they don't have a lot of the sort of more data processing, data QA, and data analysis capabilities that they need to build out because of funding limitations.
Yeah. So there are some situations, if you jump backwards, where you might jump a stage, or unique situations. We've had some clients like that where they're on the advanced stage, but they're not doing anything from before that. They've skipped the intermediate phase. And those are some unique situations. But that goes back to the business model, where when you identify those opportunities and you quantify that, to them, it didn't make sense to perform that intermediate, build a data warehouse. They are just performing some very limited forecasting for specific things. But generally, it follows this trend. And often you would find once you get to intermediate, it might not make sense to go to advanced. You perform that business, you have a look at the business case, and it doesn't make sense to hire a data scientist and build the infrastructure that you need to take that step.
So once you've defined your capability gap and you're clear on the direction you're going, there's the further challenge of, as you're scaling, to ensure you don't break the team. And we've had quite a few examples of this. So maybe, James, you can just comment on that growth path. And what is that growth path look like? What are some of the options that companies face? And what are the outcomes they're trying to deliver?
If we're talking about options, you've got the outsource, insource, or offshore. And it depends on where they are on that maturity curve that we just spoke about and what the gap is there. So generally what I find is for the engineering roles, they work quite well offshore. The key to doing the offshore, and in fact, even if it was in-house, how to scale that effectively without breaking would be getting the right specialization. So instead of having generalists, have specialists, have the process in place and have the technologies in place. So it's important because it's going to be difficult to scale if you don't have the correct process. So if you're following an agile process, that means having that down with your regular scrums and stand-ups and having the correct templates in place as part of that process through a workflow for project to project that makes sense, as well as having the correct technologies in place to support that. If you don't have the correct technologies, it's also not going to scale. But that goes back again to your architecture. So get your architecture correct, get your process and in place, and the correct people you need to specialize here. And that's going to allow you to scale with our brain.
I mean, that's a very key point. I see too many businesses that do what they've always done, and they grow in a linear way, and they have a whole bunch of generalists. That poses two problems. There's no career path for generalists, and you can't have too many generalists because you tend to find they want to do the same thing, but actually some are much better at doing one thing over another. So almost every team that's been successful will move towards more specialized roles. And you don't want a very valuable data analysts or data engineers doing the more maybe transactional processing area. And that's where, especially in the area of data processing, data analysis, the specialization brings all those outcomes you see there around resilience, increased productivity, high quality output, and increased retention of staff.
So The other thing would be the reason why we see that it goes back to the business case. When you're first starting out, oftentimes it makes sense to hire a journalist because there's not enough work as you see it to support an entire team of specialists. But that might work in the short term. But as you scale, you will need to specialize. It doesn't make sense to hire journalists after that.
So now you've worked out your capability requirement. You've determined the capability plan that you need to move towards and what the growth path might look like. But you're trying to weigh up where you should scale, because doing everything in the UK or the US or somewhere in Western Europe would be quite expensive. And you saw from that previous graph, quite slow, because you only have so much funding to get to where you want to get to. You start to look at other options. And this is where offshore becomes incredibly attractive. And it's not just about cost. There are many other criteria. And my advice is start with the criteria, be clear about what those criteria are. Certainly funding is going to be one critical consideration. And you can see here we've compared 3 locations, Bangalore in India in gray versus Romania in blue and in orange, South Africa. Now, I focus mostly on the more junior end of the scale because at the most senior, there probably isn't so much difference, but at junior, there are some distinct differences. And for example, cost in Bangalore is a lot more cost attractive than the nearshore locations of South Africa and Romania. But as you said earlier, it's not the main reason. It may not be the only reason. There are many other factors which are key considerations. So your ability to recruit quickly. So speed is a key consideration. So Bangalore does very well on speed. And then you've got capability level and availability. And those are another key considerations. And depending on the kind of capability you're looking for, Bangalore tends to do very well in the engineering space, but in the data analysis area, because of the near time, you may prefer to have a nearshore location, and that can be better fit. Proximity for some clients, because they want to get out to their teams regularly, because maybe they're in the EU and there's a GDPR requirement. So Romania may be a better fit in that respect. But then if they're looking for a way of operating in a more agile way, the integration of the teams, so teams are not separated, they're very much integrated in the way they're operating, having the right cultural fit, the right accent is another key consideration. So there, South Africa especially, but also Romania, can perform very well. And there's always the question around retention. Now, I've always asked this question. Actually, I think one area of retention is not so location dependent. It is not true that, say, India has worse retention than a nearshore location like Romania. It's just not the case. Retention is more often about the availability of career path, the inclusiveness of the company and the way they make their staff feel who are operating remotely, the opportunity to work on new areas rather than just on legacy. So that's what's really going to promote the retention of staff, less to do with the location. So I then come to how to build. So you've got a clear idea now on the steps, but how would you then go about building your data analytics capability growth plan? And this is something that James does with many of our clients. So James, maybe you can just lead us through this. So I highlighted this already, but lead us through this in respect to these different stages of maturity.
So we did touch on this briefly before, but the process that we go through is to try to understand your vision and objectives, not just for analytics, but for your business as a whole. High level, just understanding of the business. Then make sure that the analytics team, the vision and objectives of that align with the overall goals of the business. And then identify where you are right now, what you have in place in terms of teams, roles, architecture, and assets, and understand according to that vision, where exactly would you like to get to? So that gives us an idea of, in terms of capabilities, what you have now and where you want to go and what that gap is. So from there, based on where you are now and the things that you have in place in your organization, we can then answer some questions around the data architecture. So that falls into that 5-tiered architecture that we spoke about before. And this informs as to which of those capabilities do you need and what technologies, or at least what are the selection criteria that we're going to use to select those technologies in this data architecture. So once you have a data architecture, then you can move on to building your capability plan. And that is about having a look at your existing stock, what roles there are, and understanding which of those staff members can you use or do you want to use as analytics team, if there are any. And then based on the data architecture and the technologies that are going to be used, you can start building JDs for these roles. So build an org structure and have an org chart for this team, then move on to the JDs and job requirements for when you start hiring. Then once you have this team in place, you can work with the team on an implementation plan or pilot. So it's important to choose a first opportunity that gives you the highest value for the least amount of effort, and start simple and start smooth with the pilot phase, and try to get those processes in place during this pilot phase.
We've highlighted here the example teams by maturity stage. This is very indicative, and so it needn't be like this, but I think what you can see here is as you scale your team, as you move up the value chain for what you're trying to do, there's greater specialization. I don't know if there's any other comments you'd like to make about this in respect to org structure as well, James.
Yeah. So this ties back a bit to one of our previous slides where we were speaking about whether you insource, you outsource, or you offshore. And what you may find is as you're moving between these stages, you're looking to specialize, but perhaps you cannot, in terms of that business case, building a business case, you cannot build the business case for one role yet. That's where you might look at doing some consulting for one of these roles. You might initially bring someone, do some consulting, you outsource it temporarily and move that in-house as you move through these stages, as you scale. Other comment I would make is, like Charles mentioned, you don't necessarily need all of these roles. It's all dependent on your organization, which of these you would choose and which of them make sense to you. And some of them you might find that you would hire earlier on. You might, in the intermediate phase, you may choose never to move to that advanced phase, but you still scale your team within that intermediate phase. So a lot of the supporting functions like data QA, data processes, the report creators, you would scale that up within that intermediate phase.
Thank you, James. I think we come to the end of the presentation area, and now I'd like to move to some of the questions. I see some very interesting questions have come through. The first one I'd like to address to you is, how should I integrate my technology and data teams? One that's very frequently asked, because most clients I think we engage with, they already have a technology team, but they don't necessarily have the same maturity in the data area. How do you address this?
This depends on the processes that you have in place. If you're following an agile process, it would also depend on the projects. But one way that I've seen this done is on a project to project basis, you include members that are involved in those tasks within the same Scrum team. So in the daily stand-ups and during the Scrum meetings and your retrospectives, you would include those team members. So they're working. You would build teams that include members from both of those teams on projects where they work together. The other thing that's important is to take stakeholders from both, the tech leads from both teams, and include them in the strategic discussions before these projects take place. So if you have a technology project, there might be some analytics overlap, and vice versa. There might be some opportunity for the technology team to offer insight or guidance. So have the tech leaders or the stakeholders from both teams present in those more strategic discussions.
Another question we have seen addressed here is the statement here is data engineering, data scientists are incredibly expensive, and there's data analysis as well. How can they benefit from using low code or lower cost data analytics tools? And to what degree can that change capabilities required to scale the team?
So, unfortunately, I would have to say that in many of these teams, many of the cases already using cost or low code solutions. So something like Power BI, for example, would be considered low code or no code. You can use Power Apps and Power Query. Those are all no code or low code environments. So a lot of these tools, your professionals like data analysts and data scientists would be using them. So the danger here, the risk with low cost, low code, I think it's great to use it, but the danger would be is if you use it and you don't have the correct individual, like a data engineer or data modeler, to set up the correct best practices, you find yourself in a situation where it's going to hurt you more in the long run to fix these problems in the future than it would be to have the correct people in place. So I think if you have if you have a couple of these stakeholders, if you have a data engineer that has those modeling capabilities and he's able to ensure that in that ETL process, the best practices are followed, you can use low code, no code tools, and you can put some of your less technologically skilled employees to produce this, to get more of these workflows and transformations out. But you do want an individual that's able to oversee that and make sure best practices are followed.
I think we have time for one more question, which is linked to that last point. And that's, how should I manage the data analytics career path of junior data staff? Now, this is one that we see time and time again, where especially in the early stage data teams, staff are often doing many different things. And they come to believe that they are on the track to being data engineers. But actually, in reality, they're a very long way away. And just because they're utilizing certain tools, there's a belief that transition to that level is achievable. And then there's a dawning that happens where the company realizes they really need to start specializing. And some staff are not going to make the grade, that they're going to have to remain, or what is really a data processing activity, versus bringing in different resources to deliver data analysis. And maybe, James, maybe you can highlight this from some of our experiences and also point out how you can make sure you don't make this mistake around career path, because that can lead to some fallout.
So we've seen that with a couple of our clients. And I think the very important thing to do here is to manage expectations from the onset. Clearly define what are the career path options and set requirements for each of those. Clear requirements and a clear path to that. So especially for large jumps, like if a data processor is looking to move on to the analyst track or engineering track, I think it's perfectly all right to encourage that, as it is a natural progression, but it is a big jump to move from a data processor into the engineering track. So getting towards a SQL developer or a junior data engineer, that is a large jump. So it's important to identify perhaps some certifications that are required, set clear requirements there so that you can manage expectations.
Thank you for that, James. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. This brings the first high performance capability planning session to an end. Please reach out to myself if you'd like to know more about the process for building your data analytics capability plan and how we can help you with that, and how we can help you understand the kind of capability available out there in many of these offshore locations. Thank you. The recording will be available online. And thank you, and help join us for the next one, which I believe will be sometime in August, September. Goodbye.